Now let me just contextualize a little bit the meeting of today. We are now with an audience which is made by students of the Bachelor in Political Science, International Relations and Human Rights. Some others are students and the faculties, of course, also the PhD in Human Rights, Society and Multi-Level Governance. I think the majority is made of students from the master's course in Human Rights and Multi-Level Governance, in which we have established a couple of years ago a master's class in children's rights, which is now led by Professor Arianna Saulini. And this master's class has been established in the framework of an agreement that we have established with the Human Rights Center of Padua University has established with Save the Children Italy. We have set up this Children's Rights Chair that hosts not only the master's class for our students, but also some other activities, including in the framework of offering traineeship opportunity to a certain number of students, and research opportunity. There are already some of our students who are working on their master thesis on issues that they started to study and to get deeper into after the internship they had with Save the Children. So, this agreement, this cooperation that we have already started with Save the Children is already producing some output, not only in terms of personal experience of students, but also in terms of contribution to the academic work we do in our university. So this is to say something about the audience of today, especially for the benefit of our guests. So in agreement with Save the Children and with Arianna Saulini, we thought some months ago to give a special, offer a special moment to our students at the beginning of this semester and of the master's class in children's rights. And we thought to invite a guest speaker to have this inaugural lecture of the master's class. And that's why we invited Professor Ton Liefaard to give this Lectio magistralis today. So a few words about our guest. Ton Liefaard is a member of the law school of the University of Leiden. In particular, is professor of children's rights, and is also UNICEF chair in children's rights at his university. He has been the director of a master's program in advanced studies in international children's rights. He is also the coordinator of a children's rights school, which takes place in different parts of the world, so maybe we can tell us something about this project. And he has, of course, published extensively in the area of children's rights in general, the CRC, child-friendly justice, juvenile justice, and also recently on children's rights and bioethics. He has also served as a justice in some courts in the Netherlands and has been the consultant for many international organizations, the Council of Europe, UNICEF, the UN, and so on, in areas that relate to the rights of the child. So I'm very pleased to give him the floor now, and the title, as you know, of his lecture today is A Fresh Sight on the Convention of the Rights of the Child and Beyond. Thank you very much.
Buongiorno. Good morning. My Italian is not that good, so I will speak in English. It's such an honor to be here in this beautiful room, in this very old university. I would like to thank the organizers, the Human Rights Center, Save the Children, for inviting me to talk about what I like to talk about most, and that is international children's rights. I am particularly happy to see so many students in the room. Students, I think, form our capital to bring children's rights and human rights more generally further. The subtitle of my talk is How to Make Children's Rights Sustainable. And it's a question that is justified at the point at which we celebrate, or at least pay tribute to 30 years of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. The key question is, how do we move from here? How do we preserve the momentum for children's rights? How do we make sure that we reach children throughout the globe, wherever they are, wherever they live, in whatever the situation they find themselves in? Building on 100 years of Save the Children, the visionary work of Eglantine Jepp, the leadership she showed in the beginning of the former century, which served as a huge source of inspiration throughout the century up until now, and connecting that to 30 years of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which in my view can also serve as a source of inspiration, even though we have to be critical at the same time, is an enormous opportunity. And if we can then educate our students on this, then I think we have potential. So it's absolutely wonderful to be here. This is a really old university. You get that feeling when you're in this room, obviously. But it's really, really old. And I just want to make that point. I studied at the University of Amsterdam, the free one. That one was established in the beginning of the former century. Well, a little bit more than 100. Not really spectacular. My own university, Leiden University, is the oldest university in the Netherlands. And this year we celebrate 444. In Dutch we vieren 444, and vieren is the same as four. So we have a lot of fours in our midst at the moment. And we are extremely proud, more than 4 centuries of also legal education, but also laureates, alumni, professors, and then you're here. 8 centuries. This is the real stuff. This is where it started in Europe. This is what Leiden also built on. So I'm very, very happy and pleased to be here. And I think the chair of today, this morning, you mentioned it this morning, like our rector last week when we celebrated our Dies Natalis. Universities have always been there. They are the constant factor. Politicians come and go. But the universities, they stay and they go on. And they can think about societal issues in a free academic environment. And that is absolutely crucial. So, okay, having said that, I will take you to children's rights now. I was asked to talk about 30 years and to reflect on what we have done so far and how to move beyond. And provide a fresh sight. Well, that is quite a challenge, but I will do my best. And I hope you come up with your questions and your reflections on the basis of your work, on the basis of your studies, on the basis of your personal interest, and that we can have an exchange on children's rights in the course of this morning. I will just reach out, if I may. Can I? So I would like to take you back to November 1989. November 1989, particularly the 20th of November, was the moment at which the international community adopted, I should say, the Convention on the Rights of the Child. That was done in New York, and you see the General Assembly. That's where the states voted, and then the Secretary General of the UN took pictures with children, an important political moment, an achievement, so there's room for celebration. In the middle of that row, you see Audrey Hepburn, for those who may have recognized her, and she was the then Goodwill Ambassador of UNICEF, and that one of her roles was to persuade politicians, and they always like to take pictures with a famous actress or actor, so that is working. So they paved the way for adoption, and before that there was 10 years of drafting. And the Declaration of the Rights of the Child of 1924 was the first international document on children's rights, and it was based on the assumption that children are in need of special care and protection because of their vulnerability. And that was particularly true in that period of time after World War I. The international community was really, I think, made aware that children suffer the most in times of distress, and the 1924 Declaration on the Rights of the Child reflects that notion. The 1924 Declaration was basically reconfirmed after World War II and a little bit elaborated upon, and that resulted in another declaration of 1959. But still declarations, so no legally binding treaties. And then in 1979, Poland took the initiative to suggest to turn the Declaration of 1959 into a treaty that would be legally binding and would be enforceable. And that was picked up, and instead of copy-pasting the declaration, one started to draft and to elaborate, and that resulted in a comprehensive treaty that includes civil and political rights, but also economic, social, cultural rights. And if you compare that to the general human rights treaties, you see that we have these separated. Also in Europe, we have a separate Convention of Human Rights, which is basically about civil and political rights. And then we have the Economic Social Charter, but the Convention on the Rights of the Child combines these two categories of rights. I also showed a picture of the Berlin Wall, which was torn down in the same month, a little bit earlier, and it was representing the end of the Cold War. Today we may have another Cold War, and I'm not going into that into detail, but at that point in time it was important. The tension between the East and the West was there, but it also started to fade away. And it affected also the drafting. And I think one of the outcomes of that was that there is both economic, social, cultural rights included, as well as the civil, political rights. And the economic, social, cultural rights are more about the state providing services to citizens, while civil and political rights are, of course, there are positive obligations, but they are primarily about protecting individuals against an overpowering state. And that was more the Western idea behind human rights, and the other part of the world was more focused on the other. But I mean, I'm just making the point because we have to see a convention as a product of its time. And that's absolutely important. It has to go along with how the world evolves and how, in this particular case, children actually live and the realities in which they find themselves. So, if we go to the next one, this is the world of today. Today we are celebrating, not this today, but this year we are, talking about 30 years of the convention. The convention builds on human rights. 17 years ago we accepted that human rights were so fundamental that we incorporate them in the Universal Declaration, and that generated the attention for international human rights and also the incentive to regulate human rights at the international level. So international human rights law started to emerge, and children's rights have been part of that. More importantly, they have been built on the notions of human dignity, of equality, and these fundamental notions can be found in the Convention as well. But in this time, there is also the International Development Agenda, the SDGs. And the Children's Rights Convention connect to that as well. So one of the important challenges today, I think, is how to connect the human rights framework to the SDG framework. And I think one of the avenues could be the Convention on the Rights of the Child. I'll come back to that towards the end. But the world has changed. There is much more known and shared about new family forms. Reproductive assistance is common nowadays. There are examples of surrogacy used as for parents to get children. A very topical question here as well. But the reality is also that the more one-sided focus on nuclear family as the family where children live in is not connecting to how children live. Children live in communities, they live in broader families, extended families. And that's something that is now much more apparent than in the 1980s. Children live in an online world. There's an offline world and an online world, and they are closely connected, but children live in an online world. They didn't live in an online world like today in the 1980s. That has really changed. But the parents have lived in the 1980s. They matured in the 1980s, and they are not that connected to online like their children. Their children are much smarter in terms of digital environment. My children, they don't really care about the television. They are much more focused on the iPad. You know, my youngest daughter, 5 years old, she was standing like this before the television. And, you know, so it's showing that she is living in a different world than I did. Then, children are protesting. Children are making a claim that their environment, their future is at risk, and that the current politicians have to act to also preserve their chances in the future. This was a protest organized by students from the secondary schools in the Netherlands, modeled after, of course, the Belgium example. And that is something that is much more apparent nowadays, also through social media, than in the 1980s. And then there is a growing awareness that it's not only the state that is a duty bearer under human rights law, but it's also non-state actors. So, for example, business is connected to human rights, and also specifically to children's rights. So Save the Children and UNICEF have developed these children's rights and business principles. And it's now a matter to find out, also through research, what that means, what that delivers, and what that ultimately results in for children. Are you okay there on the floor? Good. But taking you back to the 1989, what was there to celebrate? Well, it has already been mentioned. Children are, with the convention, regarded as human rights holders, not because they are the future, but because they are human beings today. That is absolutely crucial. And that was a game changer. The 1924 Declaration was built on a different notion. It was built on the notion that children were vulnerable, like women at that point in time. And it was technically, the title was the rights of the child, but it was not so much about granting rights. It was about what mankind owes to children. So children were the object of care and protection. They were not so much considered to be subject of human rights. That was absolutely changed with the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and it affects the way we accommodate children in our legal systems, and should accommodate them. But at the same time, realistically, children are a broad category, and within the group of children there's a wide variety of different kinds of children. So you have babies, you have toddlers, you have, let's say, 10, 12-year-olds, and you have the adolescent. And in one or the other way, we have to recognize that also in our human rights approach and in our legal systems. So the Convention incorporated concepts such as evolving capacities and age and maturity. So, for example, children have the right to be heard. But the question, what do you do with the input of children, can be made dependent on the age and maturity of children. So it's important to recognize that children develop, and therefore they have a dynamic legal status, a dynamic legal position from a human rights perspective. I think very realistic, but also very complex. Because when do you, for example, acknowledge that children have a certain level of autonomy in decision making, for example, in the medical field? It's not easy. But the assumption that children have a certain level of autonomy in medical cases, in medical situations, is based on the human rights notion, recognizing that children evolve over time. And then the third important pillar underlying the Convention is that children are members of family. The preamble of the Convention recognizes that the family of the child is actually the best place for a child to be in. It's the best place for an harmonious development as a starting point. Of course, we all know that sometimes family is not the best place for children, but it gives us a very strong basis to advocate for recognizing children's family, for example, when they are on the move and alone. It also gives us a very strong argument to take on board family if you are taking care of their interest in child protection cases. So it is, I think, not only a very important starting point, it's a realistic one. Children do relate to family, extended family, parents, and it's also something that is proven to be useful also in the legal systems across the globe. So we have a special treaty for children, special for a special group of human rights. That's why I call it a special human rights treaty. It's comprehensive because we have these civil and political rights and economic, social, cultural rights. And if you zoom in on the text, I don't know whether you've already looked into the convention, but there you see provisions that are about protection of children, for example, against violence, against exploitation. There are provisions about provisions. So education, healthcare, interestingly, the right to play, Article 31, very important. Some people start laughing if I start talking about Article 31, the right to play, but it's important that children have the room and time and opportunity to play. It's important for their development. And even in the most stressful situations, a playground can do the trick and can make a difference. I'm sure people from Save the Children recognize that. Child-friendly places, even within the most difficult situations. And there is participation, and participation is something I would like to touch upon a bit later because it's a fundamental element of recognizing children as human rights holders, is that they also have the right to participate. And participation rights come with the freedom of expression and the freedom of assemble and also get the right to get access information and media. But a core article is Article 12, the right to be heard. And it states basically that in all matters affecting children, in the decision-making affecting children individually or as a group, children have the right to be heard. And it has been explicitly recognized, and that's something to embrace when you implement children's rights comprehensively. And that's also one of the general principles, and other general principles are the best interest of the child and non-discrimination and the right to development. And that is life and development, and that is, you could say, the very core of the convention. There are 3 optional protocols, 2 on substantive issues, armed conflict and the protection of children against sexual exploitation, child pornography, among others. And then there is the 3rd optional protocol, and that provides children with the right to lodge an individual communication in Geneva before the Committee on the Rights of the Child. And if I'm not mistaken, Italy has, for example, ratified that. So it's interesting to see if there's a case brought to Geneva from Italy. So we have a comprehensive, multi-layered and evolving children's rights framework. And what do I mean? It's comprehensive, and I discussed that. It's evolving because we see that it's evolving over time, and that courts, for example, play a very active role in connecting the children's rights framework to the everyday realities of today. And it's multi-level because it's of course based in the UN, an international UN treaty, but it started to trickle down to the European regional human rights system, to the inter-American human rights system, and also to ASEAN, the Southeast Asian nations collaboration, and also in Africa. So we have now a much more multi-layered setup of children's rights instruments, which altogether form a comprehensive framework, which needs to be studied and explored further, and I would like to share some thoughts on that in the course of my talk. So if we go to the next one. Yes, thanks. What is the meaning then, or what has been the meaning so far? Where do we stand after 30 years? And I would like to give you some perspective. The first perspective is this one, and that is almost universal ratification. Is there someone from the US in the room? Hello, and in the back, all right, welcome to you in particular, but your country is a little bit lighter in blue, and that is for a reason, because your country, I'm afraid, is the only country that has not ratified. the convention, and all other countries have ratified. So 196 countries have ratified, endorsed the convention. The US is the only one that has not. For some people, and I think they have a point, they say this is the most successful treaty, the most successful human rights treaty because of this ratification status. And I think they are right to a certain degree. This is powerful. This enables us to talk about children's rights with students from across the globe. It means that Save the Children and UNICEF can talk about children's rights everywhere. And that is powerful. So even in the most difficult circumstances, you can talk about children's rights because the governments you're talking to have committed themselves in one or the other way to the convention. But of course, it's not enough. There are countries that have made reservations. Some reservations are quite fundamental. Some countries are also withdrawing reservations after a while, and maybe after a while they think that it's not that scary anymore. But there is nevertheless reservations, and of course implementation is leaving behind. So that means that this is not enough, but it's an interesting starting point to consider that children's rights are globally accepted in a way. And we are still working on the US, of course. Then, what has been the impact? Another perspective on meaning, on the meaning of the CRC. Well, a wide variety of different types of impact. You recognize this from yesterday. I gave a talk to Save the Children yesterday, and I'm doing it again a little bit in the same way. So, on the left-hand corner, there is the Children's Act of South Africa, and it reflects the quite a large number of countries that have actually started to draft specific legislation on children influenced by children's rights. And the Children's Act is about children and the family, and it's about children in alternative care. So, for example, if they are placed out of their home care into foster care or into institutions even, then the Children's Act regulates their position. The Children's Act grants children, for example, access to legal ways to claim rights. So they recognize that children have a certain level of legal capacity. In the same country, South Africa, they also have Juvenile Justice Act, a specific Child Justice Act, which was also informed by the Children's Rights Convention. This is one example, but in Africa you see many similar law reforms. In Georgia, the Republic of Georgia, in the former Soviet Union Republic, they have also developed specific legislation on children in the justice system. In my country, the Netherlands, we have transformed existing legislation in order to better accommodate children's rights. And we, for example, in 2007, included a complete ban on corporal punishment on children in the civil code. So you see that there is a lot of law reform going on, new legislation being drafted as well as existing legislation being transformed. On the right-hand corner, there is litigation. There is an emergence of litigation, courts being challenged to interpret existing legislation in conformity with the Children's Rights Convention and also to develop it further. Again, South Africa is a leading example, but also India, for example, Bangladesh. There are very interesting, enlightening examples of where courts actually hold governments to account when it comes to children's rights. Examples relate, for example, to the context of juvenile justice, and that has proven to be powerful. So the CRC has had impact through litigation. Then, in the left-hand corner, but then low, we have the movement of civil society. Civil society has used the Convention on the Rights of the Child as a tool, as a mandate, but also as a tool to advocate for children's positions. And they connect together with Child Rights Connect in Geneva, that is the connector between civil society at the local level, domestic level, and the Committee on the Rights of the Child. The UN committee, It's showing, I'm showing that because of this large movement of civil society around children's rights. And in Italy, you have the Gruppo CRC, and they have prepared the information to the Committee on the Rights of the Child. And I was informed yesterday that group, with the support and leadership of SAFE, is also continuously monitoring how children's rights are implemented in Italy. And that is, I think, a very powerful example of how CSOs could actually work with the convention on the local level. And then I mentioned that already in the ASEAN, in the African continent, in Council of Europe, the symbol of children's rights in the center is showing that children's rights have been picked up by regional organizations in order to connect the international framework to the local realities of the regions. So in Europe, for example, the Council of Europe has developed a special strategy on children's rights. First, they focused exclusively on violence, but they started to develop that into a broad agenda on children's rights, including children's rights in the digital world, children's rights of children on the move, child participation. So very important elements of children's rights have been brought much closer to the realities within Europe. And that informed also the jurisprudence of the European Court, and it also even informed the EU, and the EU started to draft legislation specifically on, for example, the position of children in conflict with the law, so in the criminal justice system. But the EU has also generated a lot of money that could be used by civil society organizations to provide for training to professionals, for example. So it's a very interesting dynamic which was inspired and fueled by international children's rights, but was brought much more and closer to the realities in a specific part of the world, in this case Europe. But we have to be real as well, and I think the introduction by you from this, it was absolutely telling that we should maybe not celebrate. We should maybe use this moment to reflect on where we stand and that we should actually do better. Because what is the meaning of children's rights when children are in critical situations, are in distress, are not recognized, are not seen enough? So the Syrian conflict can be mentioned. I was checking the data this morning again. UNICEF reported last year that there is 5.7 million children from Syria in need of humanitarian action. Some data before reported that there were millions of children displaced internally and externally. Children were also affected directly by this conflict, and it goes on and on and on. And yes, indeed, the nature of conflict has changed. It takes long. For one or the other reason, there doesn't seem to be a geopolitical solution within reach, and children suffer. So what is the meaning of children's rights there? We can talk about the 150 million children that live on the street. They have no access to services, they don't go to school, they may be picked up by the police at any given moment, they are sent to a detention center, they report to a judge, the judge orders some kind of treatment, children don't receive it, they stay in the detention center, then after a while they are released, surprise, surprise, they are back on the streets. No durable solution for them, no rights, maybe the only right they see is that they have a lawyer when they report to the case in court. But the lawyer is not really interested, he's just sitting there all day, going through all these cases. An example from Latin America. So, what is the meaning of children's rights? We don't like street children, so we keep picking them up. They can be also very seriously problematic for safety and security, but we don't like them, so we don't see them as children first, and we keep basically them away from opportunities. So what is the meaning of children's rights? Then we have children in armed conflict. It was already mentioned, one of the focus points of SAFE for this year. I'm not going to talk too much about it, but conflict has changed, and also the cross-border conflicts are particularly problematic, also from a human rights perspective, because who do you talk to? Which government do you address? And I think we have to realize that the classical way of approaching the duty bearer, the state responsible for human rights in the domestic sphere, is not enough. So we have to develop that further. And then children in detention. There is currently a global study underway, led by Professor Manfred Nowak from the University of Vienna and also from Venice. And he leads a study on children in detention, and that relates to millions of children if you take all forms of detention altogether. So then we are talking about the criminal detention, criminal justice detention, we are talking about alternative care, we are talking about administrative detention, immigration detention, we are talking about detention in cases of national security. So that affects many children, and these children are out of sight. They are not visible. They are very much dependent on the regime in these institutions. They may be placed together with adults. They may not have contact with family. And all these examples are relating to rights. If a child is detained, he has the right to stay in touch with family. Sometimes family doesn't even know that the child is detained. So these children are invisible, unheard, unseen, and that's seriously problematic. It has been a research area of myself from the very beginning of my academic work, and I'm still extremely worried about this particular issue. So let's hope that the UN study will make something move. And then new areas, children and climate change. Climate change affects children in a significant way, and I think we are not focused enough on that yet, also not in the human rights framework, so we have to develop that further. And then, of course, there are many children on the move. Children leaving one country for another, crossing borders, sometimes, like this picture, literally stuck in between. In between authorities, in between systems, in between responsibilities, in between status. And they often lose status, so they may even become stateless. And if you're stateless, then you do not have access to rights whatsoever. So that's extremely problematic. And then, of course, all the risks that come with being on the move. And being maybe smuggled into a country, being trafficked, maybe being subjected to sexual exploitation. And that makes you wonder what the meaning of children's rights is. Still, I think that even in these most difficult circumstances, children's rights provide a narrative to change. It provides a narrative to see children as children in the first place and to work on their legal rights. And that is powerful. It's strong, and even in the most difficult circumstances, you can use the Convention on the Rights of the Child to give children priority. And to make them visible and to claim that they have rights that ought to be protected. And it doesn't mean that you're successful tomorrow, but it gives you, I think, a constant opportunity to talk about the way they are being treated. And that can move us, I think. All right. Are there any questions so far? Are you doing okay? Yeah? All right. Can I share some problems with you, other than the striking examples from just now, which are problematic as such? But I think if you take a more research approach to children's rights, then you come across some more structural problems with children's rights, and why we do not really seem to have the degree of success that we maybe long for. At the same time, I want to make the point that this is still a relatively young area of law. This is children's rights, and it is 30 years, and 30 years is not much. So we have to explore the meaning of children's rights much further, and we have to do much more research and share that research with practice so that it can become practically relevant. But it's extremely important to realize that we have seen progress, and that is quite something in the past 30 years only. Right? It took more than 30 years before the European Convention of Human Rights became of some relevance, before the Court of Human Rights really started to operationalize. So this is still in its infant phase, so to say. So what are cross-cutting challenges? I would like to give you one, and that's a more technical one, and that's the next slide, and that is that we lack coordination or cooperation often. The comprehensiveness of the treaty means that we should approach children's rights comprehensively, and unfortunately you see that there is a lot of compartments in which children's rights are addressed. So there are, for example, also in the CSOs, the civil society organizations, focused organizations on, for example, justice, on child protection, on breastfeeding, on corporal punishment. And while many of the issues on children are actually crossing the different compartments. So if we really want to make children's rights, bring children's rights to a higher level, we have to recognize that. And it starts by the starting point of the Convention. The Convention claims that all rights are indivisible and that they are interrelated and equally important. A little bit difficult technically because there are conflicting rights, but the approach is clear. The approach is that we should approach this holistically, comprehensively. And children's rights issues do not stand on their own. For example, the position of children in the juvenile justice system. We are then, from a human rights perspective, primarily concerned about the rights of the children in conflict with the law, but what about the rights of victims, for example? And what about the rights of the children as victims? That is also possible. And how do you reconcile the different interests behind the rights? So, for example, children in conflict with the law have an interest in having their, future potential protected. But society has an interest in keeping the society safe, responding adequately to victims and family of victims. And that is not something that is easily reconcilable. So that's something to recognize. And it calls for coordination and cooperation. It means that you have to join forces in order to make a difference and to implement children's rights at the domestic level. So policy implications of that coordination and a national plan of action, budgets that go beyond certain departments, so not only on justice but also on child protection, for example. International and national cooperation, also between civil society organizations, that do not over-focus on yourself, but try to collaborate. And key questions are who is actually responsible, particularly in a country like Italy, where you have different regions with different kinds of responsibilities. Okay, what is then the government's responsibility and what is the responsibility of the local government, and how do you reconcile that? And who ultimately has the final responsibility? That is generally the state. It also comes with transparency and accountability through data and also through local monitoring mechanisms. So this is a more technical, cross-cutting issue that needs our attention in research and also in very practical measures on how to improve coordination and collaboration. This is a more fundamental problem, is that we have insufficient recognition and equivalence when it comes to children. There are a number of marginalized groups of children that seem to get less attention, or they do get less attention than children in other situations. It's maybe the other children and not our children. It's about children on the move. It's about children with mental health problems. It's about children in conflict with the law. It's about children that are in welfare and institutions. For one or the other reason, we don't recognize these children as the same children. So that starting point of recognizing children as human beings is interesting and fundamental. But if it ultimately results in differentiation between groups of children because of their societal status, because we don't see children as children first, but for example as criminals first, then we have a big issue in terms of implementing children's rights. Another issue where you see this is the issue of violence against children. The Convention on the Rights of the Child is very clear. Children should be protected and have the right to be protected against all forms of violence. But that's not a given. There is a clash there between local perceptions, culture, and assumptions towards violence against children, and this international standard. So for some people this is reason to claim that the CRC, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, is not universal, because if you zoom in on specific countries and even regions within countries, you will find no acceptance of the universal standard that children have to be protected against violence. And that is particularly problematic in the context of the home. So this is an issue that is also about the freedom and rights of parents. And it shows the tension between parents and children's rights and parental rights, let's put it that way. This table here shows in the green that in 166 countries there is a full prohibition of using corporal punishment as a sentence in the criminal justice system. So again, South Africa, if I'm not mistaken, 1996, until 1996, whipping was still an acceptable sentence, but that was ruled out after that. And in 166 countries, we think that we agree that corporal punishment doesn't have a place in the criminal justice system. So you can sentence someone to community sentence or to a fine or even to detention, but you don't use corporal punishment. Oh, you could say that's quite universal. But if you go to the home, that's on the other side, there's only 54 countries that have said, in the home, in the upbringing of children, there should be no violence. That's prohibited. So that means, from a criminal law perspective, that in the other countries, parents may very well go to may be prosecuted for example, molest of children, but they may say, no, I used my parental right to chastise my child. And that was even true for the Netherlands until the beginning of this millennium, where there was quite a serious case against a father, and the father said, no, I used a regional chastisement, and that is my right as a parent, and the court said, yes, you're right. And then the legislators started to draft new laws, and they said, no, we don't want that. So in the parental provisions, there is one explicit line that, yes, parents have the right and responsibility to raise children, but they may never use violence. So then you cannot use that argument anymore. But it's not a universal standard. You could say, okay, well, this is something to acknowledge, a universal instrument meant to be universal, but in reality, no support. But luckily, there is a growing number of countries, luckily, because I think it's a fundamental problem. There are countries more and more committed to change laws, but it takes some time. But the fundamental problem here is that I wonder whether we are really willing to accept that children have the same human dignity as other human beings if we do not ban corporal punishment. And it's generally reflecting how society looks at children. It generally reflects the way children are being seen in society. And that in this particular case, violence can be functional to their upbringing, for example. Maybe even in their best interest. And I think it shows that we are not really willing to accept that children are the same human rights holders as a starting point. And then I think we overlook children often. Overlook children in serious situations such as conflict. We do not acknowledge children there, and we do not acknowledge them enough in emerging issues. It took some time before we started to realize that the digital environment comes not only with risks and need for additional protection, but also with opportunities. It took time before we started to acknowledge that maybe children with gender dysphoria require our attention. It took time, and still takes time, also to recognize intersex children, for example. So, in emerging issues, difficult but we have still troubles to see children as part of that. So we may regulate things, but not acknowledging that regulations also require attention for children. So we need to work on that, and I think we need to involve children more, and that brings me to the final problem that I would like to share with you, and that is the lack of focus on participation. Participation is one of the core elements of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. This treaty, this Human Rights Treaty, has explicitly recognized that children have the right to participate. Based on Article 12, it has generated a lot of attention around participation, resulting in more attention for child-friendly justice mechanisms, for more attention for access to justice, so children accessing justice independently from their parents, for example. But the core question still is, are we really taking children seriously in this regard? Are we really willing to invest in children and what they have to say and what they have to bring forward? And do we really acknowledge that that investment in children's participation may have better outcomes in the decision-making process for society at large? There's quite a lot of evidence, and growing evidence, that if you invest in children, in including children in your decision-making, in your policy development, also in the individual decision-making, that you contribute to procedural justice, to a sense of belonging, and also to a willingness of children to accept even decisions that go against their wishes. And this is something that we are in need of much more exploration of what it actually means to include children in decision making, but it is an incentive that is underlying the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So what are prerequisites for meaningful participation of children? Well, information. And there's no point in having rights if you don't know about it. And the same is true for the right to participate. We need to invest in education and also legal empowerment of children. And we also have to think of means to provide for accountability. And yesterday I was giving a talk to Save the Children in Rome, and we discussed an example from England where there is a judge that actually wrote a letter to a child after he took a decision in a family divorce case. You may have heard of this. It can be found online, and people are writing about it. But what was the case, and I would like to share it with you. There was a family dispute that crossed borders. So the mother and the father were living in England, and the father was planning to go to Scandinavia, and the mother wanted to stay in England. And the question was, where does the child go? The child was around 12, if I'm not mistaken. And the child indicated that he would love to join his father to Scandinavia. His mother didn't agree, and the judge had to make the decision. And the judge wrote a letter, and the letter was attached to the formal judgment. And it started by, "Dear Sam." It started by explaining in quite accessible language what the judge actually decided. And if you start to read the letter, you think, well, this is nice. Yeah? The judge explains in common language what he actually did in the judgment, which was a formal document with formal language and in general not accessible that easily. So you start reading, and then all of a sudden he said, and I'm going to explain to you, Sam, that why I did not follow your wish and why I decided that you should stay with your mother. And that's a very interesting observation, because what the judge actually did, he said, listen, I know that you want to join your father, but I'm not convinced that that is your genuine wish. I am not convinced that you're not put under pressure by your father. I actually think you are. And for that reason, I think you should stay with your mother. And if things change, we can look at it later, but this is how I feel like it now, and this is my call, and I'm making the decision. It's not you, it's me, but I'm explaining to you why I don't follow you. And it's an extremely interesting example of accountability. Because what happened, the court invited the boy to come to the court and say, listen, what do you want? That's the right to be heard in practice. And the court gave due weight, as Article 12 puts it, to the views of children, but it decided otherwise. And that is exactly perfectly defendable. It's the judge that has the decision-making power, but you should report back to the child what you did with his or her input, and then you can even better explain also to the child why and you didn't follow him. But of course this is rare still. This is one judge, and he did it before, and then he included even smileys in his judgment. So this is really a judge that is into the matter. But a letter attached to a judgment is really something new. Judges in my country are also trying it. It's not easy, I can tell you. But it's a form of accountability. And it's a form of investment in the child, because it takes time to write a letter. And it takes also time and courage to do something like that in a legal culture where this has never happened before. So I think it's a form of leadership. So that's what I want to share with you. And maybe to close, I would like to make a few points in this beautiful context of academia. Children's rights are human rights, but they have to be used as a living concept, as a living instrument. So we have to develop human rights of children further. We have to continuously ask ourselves, what is the connection to be made to the world of today? And I think there is a big role for research and also for courts to play here. So courts can help us, I think, to develop the law for children further. Particularly also as a counterbalance against legislation and also political context in which many children's rights suffer. Then I think there is an opportunity to connect children's rights to the International Development Agenda. Many of the rights included in the Children's Rights Convention are connected to the SDGs, and many much of the attention that currently goes to the SDGs can be used at the benefit of children's rights. The SDGs are built on the notion that no one can be left behind. Access to justice is a very important part of it. If you go through the SDGs, you see a lot of reference to those issues that are relevant for children, but these avenues that are now in place also around SDGs, high political forums and also reports on how we are doing in terms of implementing SDGs, they can be used as a momentum also for children's rights. And on the other hand, children's rights have already this existing structure of treaty bodies reviewing state parties' reports and also regional human rights courts using also children's rights in their jurisprudence and more and more and more. And it's interesting to see that the Committee on the Rights of the Child, for example, also started to include the SDGs in its observations towards states. So for Italy, for example, there is constant reference to the SDGs that are relevant for the Italian issues. And in doing so, I think there could be some kind of cross-fertilization of the International Development Agenda and the International Children's Rights Agenda. And then finally, I think we have to connect children's rights to our legal studies. We have to see it as a special field of law that is related to human rights and building on important human rights notions, and that it's a field of law that is directly connected to society. So I would like to see us moving into the direction of the development of the field of children's rights as a field of law in society. And that's why I gladly accepted this invitation, because I see this as an opportunity to collaborate and to share also our common understanding of human rights. And then we can also maybe mature the children's rights field, because that's what we need. We need this children's rights field to become a full member of the human rights community in order to preserve children's rights in the coming years. And as part of that, we have to educate our next generation of professionals. So we have to train them properly in the potential and the limitations of children's rights in order to equip them to do a good job in their future careers. And that's why I close with two pictures. One is a recent book we published to develop the field further. The previous legal textbook on human rights of children dated from the 1990s, so we felt that it was time to do something as a follow-up, and it's quite telling that it took us 20 years to do that, so it shows that we need to have more investment also from academia in this field. We cannot do it on our own, we have to do it together, and we have to connect students to children's rights. So we have to bring them to children's rights where children's rights matter, and that's why I would like to congratulate this faculty, the Human Rights Center and Save the Children on this particular collaboration, because it is of added value. I'm absolutely sure about that. Thank you very much. I would love to hear your reflections, critical reflections, questions, clarifications. Thank you for the honor.